Miami Sports Fanatics asks Ira. See what I did there? Tyler Hero, Gut, do you think he plays tonight?
Oh, you know what? I'm really waiting on my injury report for that because I just don't think he's going to have his explosiveness. I think Tyler Hero will be active tonight. There's no reason not to be. But I'll be very curious to see if he goes out there if they need to. A lot of times Eric Spoelstra has told us this is not a matter of the situation. Guys, if they can play, they can play. I don't necessarily buy that. I think Eric does weigh the situation. Up in a series, sit out a player. In a good rhythm, don't force a player in. So it might be if the Heat get off to a good start and are rolling and he doesn't have to play Tyler Hero, that he doesn't. If the Heat are down 18-1 and he had the option, which he didn't in Game 4 in Boston, to roll out Tyler Hero, he probably will. So I think the game ultimately will dictate if and the degree of Tyler Hero we see. And what I've gone back to on all of this, Clay, is this. The Heat approach from day one of the regular season and especially day one of the playoffs is they are in it to win a championship, not just to win this game, not just to win this series. Even now, I think there's somewhat of a long view in play. So if the Heat feel they can win this game without Tyler, save him for Game 6, maybe Game 7, maybe the NBA Finals, I still think there's more than just the moment in play. Eric Spoelstra will never say that because he wants his players focused in the moment. But organizationally, I think you have to step back just a little bit also. So to me, I think sort of time and place and situation could impact Tyler's decision as well tonight. I think they will do everything they can to have him active and then literally play it minute by minute from there.
And this is one of the rare cases where I think we genuinely disagree, and maybe it's just the nuance of the phrasing of it. I don't think it's a long game thing with Tyler Hero, and the reason why I'm saying that is because those were the exact words that Joe Varden used in his column with The Athletic yesterday, and it made me cringe.
Yes,
I think what it is, it's more that, and I think the Kyle Lowry situation is a perfect one. You have to determine if a player being on the floor at whatever percentage they are helps you win that game more than another player at 100%. And with Kyle Lowry, it was, hey, in the Philly series where you have craftier type players, smaller type players, it made more sense to play him at 100% than it did Kyle Lowry at whatever percentage he was. And then, oh, by the way, his hamstring probably did improve slightly, whatever it was from the Philly series and from when he wasn't playing in the Atlanta series. I think with the Tyler Hero situation, it's one of those where if you think he can give you enough and you watch him and shoot around and you watch him, because I'm sure he training staff is really smart. They're going to put him through the paces. They're going to put him in situations where he's going to have to make that decision that you mentioned earlier on in the show, where he chooses the pull up over the drive to the bucket. And I think that's going to determine whether or not and how much. Now, I do think if they start to fall behind, then maybe Spo says, all right, we need a spark. So Tyler at 40%, whatever it is, it's better than us getting nothing right now. Like, we need to have something. So not to get the last word on this, but I do want to move on. That's kind of where my take is on that.
And one thing I'll demand.
And Ira will let me get the last word.
And the one thing I would say is what might be fascinating is if they even try Victor Oladipo off the bench first ahead of Tyler. That could tell you something.
And this is where I was going next, because the continuation of that question was, do you see any scenario where because of his defense, Victor Oladipo starts in place of Max Strus? I don't see that, because I think the way this Heat starting lineup is constructed, first off, Strus is good enough defensively. He's not a good or I would put him at slightly above average. He's been fine. His defense hasn't been the problem. You need the spacing. And for all that Victor Oladipo does well, standing there and shooting 3-point shots, even though he made the first one, standing there and shooting 3-point shots is not his forte. It never has been, and it's not going to be unless
Victor
he decides
Oladipo,
to change his
game. I agree.
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at on that. Other adjustments that the Heat could potentially make, and I want to get into this chatter with Duncan Robinson. There's not a place for him in this series, Ira. And maybe if you fall behind by a ton, and maybe you disagree with me on this, but all I needed to see in Game 4 was him miss a couple of shots, but more importantly, the foul on Jason Tatum shooting a three-pointer. It was a gut punch. And Ira, I'm sorry, but how many times do we have to see poor decisions defensively from Duncan Robinson? I'm sorry. You can say what you want about the try hard, the lack of ability, the lack of lateral. It's the poor decisions, fouling three-point shooters, fouling guys underneath the basket, weak fouls to give them a three-point play. It's that kind of stuff that there is no place for in this series. And look, it's almost to the point where I don't even care if he's hitting three-point shots. What he takes away on the defensive end of the floor, when you combine the lack of ability to guard, but also the poor decision-making, there's no place for him in this series. And I think it's going to have to be a long summer of figuring out what he can be on the defensive end of the floor to make him playable when it gets to these moment of truths defensively.
Two things. I mean, first of all, I always say lack of ability creates and leads to instability. So a foul like you saw on Jaylen Brown or other plays is because you can't be in the right place, right time and place, you wind up having to try to compensate by doing something wrong. It's the equivalency of an offensive lineman in the NFL getting his butt beat and reaching out and holding someone because that's their only option because they don't have the foot speed, they don't have the strength in that situation to do it. We're seeing that with Duncan. Just posted an interesting story at sunsentinel.com on Duncan Robinson. That 5-year, $90 million contract he signed really isn't $90 million. He has about $10 million in incentives or guarantees to make. One of them, a very interesting clause was, if the Heat at any point in that contract win a championship, he can get his final $10 million guarantee. Well, he could ride the coattails this year. So the Heat covered themselves and said he also has to appear at least in 70 regular season games that season, average at least 25 minutes that season, appear in 3/4 of his team's games in the postseason, and average 25 minutes in the postseason. He's below the games appeared now. He's way below the threshold of minutes played. He's averaging about 11 plus or so. So I think the Heat were smart in that respect because even they realized Duncan might be part of a championship team, but he might not be the reason they are a championship team. And we're seeing that all play out right now. And it's a matter of he's more of a specialist. You know what, Clayton, it's interesting because you and I, from when we started doing our Slomin's Inside the Paint, show way back when, even before our good friends at Slomin's Home Security signed on, we talked about this Duncan contract and how it's so different because previously when the Heat had one-dimensional shooters, going back to Jason Capono, going back even more recently to James Jones, they reached a point where they realized they couldn't play them starters minutes or even rotation minutes because the defense would catch up to them. And that's what made the contract of Duncan so interesting in the first place. Didn't they realize this point was coming? And maybe it's just because they finally got Max Strus, they realized there's a better option. It's going to be interesting. And I think that he could package the number 27 first-round draft choice. I think that he could put another sweetener with Duncan to move him because that'll be the way of getting rid of him. So we always talk about players. Are they good enough to be traded on their own as a value to another team, or does there have to be a sweetener? And, of course, the ultimate this season was Russell Westbrook with the Lakers, where you realize if you want to get rid of that horrific contract, you have to attach a first-round pick or something else. I think that could be Duncan also. So I'm curious. I'm curious the level of the sweetener that the Heat go to move on from Duncan. I think that's going to be really interesting. I agree.
I agree, and hopefully we're not talking strictly about off-season moves the next time we meet here next Wednesday. Hopefully we're still talking about games. But I keep going back to this. I can deal with missing shots. I can deal with, the lack of ability. And I do think you're right that some of the fouls are because you're not there quickly enough. But, man, the Jason Tatum three-pointer foul to me, that was where I was like, that's it. Like, you can't do it anymore because there's going to come a point, and I'm going to switch gears back to a comment that we just got from Miami Sports Fanatics. There comes a point where you're like, we can't afford that. You're almost lucky that happened in a game that you were going to lose regardless. But if you get to a game, and I do think you're as crazy as this sounds, because I felt this way for each of the last two games, I think we're going to get to the point now with this series where it's going to be possession for possession. It's not going to be a blowout. That can't happen. It can't happen in the second quarter. It can't happen at the end of the first quarter, and it certainly can't happen in the fourth quarter. You can't allow that to change a game. Now, Miami Sports Fanatics brings up a comment about the officiating, and we talked about that a lot earlier in the program, but I want to talk specifically about his comment about Game 4. He says he felt like it took away the physicality from the Heat in Game 4. I think it did in Game 3. And I think, and that's the game where, and I was actually listening to Ruth Riley Hunter and Jason Jackson. I've never once heard Ruth Riley Hunter talk about officiating. I mean, I love listening to her analysis. She's so good and she's so on point. And you can hear it's kind of a player's perspective where it's like,
Sure,
you got to play through officiating. Ira, it was the first time I ever heard her talk about officiating and how uneven it was and how bad it was. And it was a lot of comments about it because it was terrible. I think it took away their physicality in that game. Maybe in game 4, had they been able to score enough early on to set their defense on the other end, maybe we could be having that conversation. And again, the officiating was bad, but it has not caused a team to lose a game so far. In game 5 tonight, you can't let the fear of bad officiating affect your physicality. And this gets to your point. You have to go out there and be you. You have to be physical. And hopefully on the offensive end of the floor, you're getting more buckets. Hopefully it's one of those things where, hey, role players play better at home. You have a big Max Strus game. Gabe Vincent steps up and hits a couple of shots off the bench like he did in game 1. But you can't let the concern of bad officiating seep in and take away from your physicality, because if you do that, you've already lost. And I do think maybe that fear was part of the reason why game 4 was so bad, not the reason why they lost, but you can't let that impact you the rest of the series.
Yeah, and you got to move on that. And if you're going in with that in your head, and I don't think that was the case in game 4, you're in trouble anyway. You go out and you play the game. The NBA, I mean, look, these are the best officials the NBA have left. They pair the staff at the start of the playoffs. They cut after the first round. They cut after the second round. So if you're complaining about these officials, these are still who the NBA believe are the best. And again, I go back to my comment of, if a team has 9 or fewer turnovers, under 10 turnovers, you're saying great game, there will be 9 mistakes by the officiating crew. There just will be. That's a good game. That's just what happens. In an NBA game, teams commit turnovers, errors. Team miss free throws, mistakes. Things happen. They happen with the officials also. You just don't want it to get egregious, but you have to be the team that's the instigator. You have to be the team that plays with force, that gets you to the foul line. I agree. And you also have to be smart and avoid foul trouble, because we've learned in this series there are irreplaceable players. Bam gets in foul trouble, you're in trouble. There's no easy answer. PJ Tucker gets in foul trouble to a degree with his defense, you're in trouble. There is no easy answer there. Same thing with Jimmy Butler. You also have to play smart. You want to be aggressive, but you don't want to be stupid aggressive.
Yeah, and to that point, somebody asks, Lenny asks about playing Markieff Morris instead of PJ Tucker.
Again, 102 games into this, you are who you are. PJ Tucker, when he missed Markieff Morris, when he missed the 58 games, that ship has sailed. This is who you are. There is no going to the laboratory. When you're going into the laboratory at the end of May, you're in deep, whatever you want to call it.
Well, and I think his question is about being thin up front, and I think probably the assumption, and not to put words in your mouth, that PJ being shorter than Markieff Morris, maybe you have to get taller. That's not the issue with this series. It's not like guys are just shooting over PJ Tucker. What PJ Tucker brings you in the ability to switch off, guard Jason Tatum, switch off onto Jaylen Brown, and you're fine with that. Switch off onto Al Horford, and you're fine with that. Guys aren't shooting over him. That's not the problem. There are plenty of other issues that this team is going through that are far bigger than that. So, Ira, I know we don't really have a feel for this, but do you have – is a prediction even worth asking you about for tonight? How do you see tonight playing out based on what you know?
Based on what I know, the second half of the season, based on what I've seen to this point, the Boston Celtics are the better basketball team than the Miami Heat. They have more talent on their roster. They have a defensive system that was number 1 in the NBA and has shown it. So again, I think it's going to have to be, if the Heat not overachieving, the Heat overcoming. The Heat, to win any game in this series, has to be a better version of themselves than the Celtics do. Because the Celtics have Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. The Miami Heat have Jimmy Butler. So unless Kyle Lowry gets one of those 20-point fourth quarters, or someone steps up and Tyler Hero makes his breakthrough, it simply will be harder for the Heat. So for the Heat to win tonight and to win the series, they have to play the better team game. Boston has a little bit more leeway, and that's what we saw in game 4, and that's what we've seen in Boston's victories. Still comes out to the injury report. Does Marcus Smart play? Does Robert Williams play? Does Tyler Hero play? We have to wait to see how that plays out as well.
Is this a must-win? If the Heat lose tonight, is it over?
It just isn't, because both teams have shown they can win on the other team's court. It'll put a hell of a lot of pressure on you. The Heat have not played in an elimination game with this roster yet. They didn't have to play an elimination game to get the number 1 seed. That was decided before the final game of the regular season. They had the luxury of sitting out Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry in game 5 against Atlanta. No pressure there. They went into Philadelphia, never forced that game 7. So yeah, it's must win as far as You don't want to have to play an elimination game. Elimination games are awful. We know that. We know even what it was like for the Panthers being down 3-0. So it's a must-win because you spent all year saying, we're playing number one for number one, whether we get the Nets in the first round, whether we get a harder first-round series. This is what we're doing. This is why you played 82 of these 102 games to wind up with home court, to say to yourself, at worst, we give ourselves 2 chances to close it out. So this is a huge game for the Heat. I wouldn't say must win, but it's a huge with a bunch of U's in the middle of that word. That's the way I'd say it.
Guys, thanks so much. Enjoy the game tonight. Again, hopefully we're talking more basketball and not off-season moves coming up on our next Inside the Paint show. It's been fun. Thanks as always for making this great. The Big O Show rolls on next right here. Thanks again.
This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.